This will completely ruin his career. He won't even know what hit him. Donald Trump's words echoed through the Fox News dressing room as he adjusted his red tie in the mirror. His reflection showed a confident man, but the eyes of his communications advisor, Mark Reynolds, showed genuine concern. Reynolds nervously checked his watch. There were only 12 minutes left until they went on air for one of the most watched interviews of the week. Subscribe now and leave your like. You are about to see the confrontation that shocked the world and the mainstream media tries to hide. Activate the bell. Mr. President, with all due respect, perhaps we should stay focused on the new Africa strategy as agreed. We are trying to repair relations, not inflame, Mark. Trump interrupted, turning with a confident smile. Americans don't care about diplomacy. They want strength, ratings, entertainment. And that's what I'm going to give them. He pulled out his phone and scrolled quickly through his Twitter feed, pleased with the buzz his appearance was already generating. Look at this, he said, showing the screen to Reynolds. 2 million people waiting to watch me talk about countries they can't even locate on a map. Reynolds took a deep breath, trying one last approach. The State Department has prepared specific points about our new economic initiatives. Secretary Thompson emphasized that we need to avoid antagonizing new regional leaders, especially those with Russian and Chinese connections. Trump snorted, returning the phone to his inside jacket pocket. Thompson is weak. Everyone knows that. That's why the Russians and Chinese are taking advantage, recruiting these little captains and republic dictators to their side. He paused, adjusting his cuffs. Africa needs to know who's boss. America first, always. A production assistant knocked on the door, announcing 5 minutes until the show began. Reynolds felt his stomach sink. He knew that look in Trump's eyes, the same one that had preceded several diplomatic incidents in recent years. At that very moment, 5,000 miles away, the afternoon sun was shining on the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, where Ibrahim Traoré was meticulously studying a dossier on American foreign policy. The young leader of Burkina Faso, just 35, had cancelled all of his meetings that morning. The room was simple for a presidential office: concrete walls decorated with local art, a national flag, and a large wooden desk covered with documents arranged in neat stacks. Through the open window, one could hear the movement of the city and feel the dry heat characteristic of the Sahel region. Traoré adjusted his thin-framed glasses, taking notes as he read. His military uniform was impeccably pressed, contrasting with the dark circles under his eyes that revealed consecutive nights of intense work. Fox News has confirmed that Trump will speak about Africa today, said Mamadou Konate, his communications advisor, entering the room with a tablet in hand. Tall and thin, Konate had served as a diplomat at the United Nations before returning to help rebuild the country. Our contacts in Washington indicate that he intends to use our country as an example of failure of leadership. Traoré looked up from the file, carefully marking the page where he had left off. What specific information does he have about our operations against terrorist groups in the north? Apparently out-of-date French intelligence reports, Konate replied, consulting his notes. Nothing about our recent victories or the reopening of schools in the reclaimed areas. A thoughtful silence filled the room as Traoré slowly closed the file, his eyes revealing a calculated intensity. He stood, walking over to the map of Burkina Faso hanging on the wall, studying the highlighted regions that represented areas reclaimed from terrorist control in recent months. Set up the video conference room, he said finally, and connect me with the Fox director. Mr. President? Konate asked, confused. Wouldn't it be better to prepare an official response after the interview? Traditional diplomacy suggests. Traditional diplomacy is what has kept African nations as secondary players on the global stage for decades. Traoré interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Trump does not respect diplomatic notes or official statements. He respects direct confrontation and, above all, television ratings. He leaned closer to the window, surveying the city he had sworn to protect. If Trump wants to use us as a pawn in his political game, he continued, we must be prepared for a counterattack that no one expects. The determination in his voice made Konate freeze momentarily. In his 20-year diplomatic career, he had never witnessed an African leader willing to directly confront the American president on national television. It would be an unprecedented move, sir, he warned. The repercussions of remaining silent are greater, Traoré responded. Our nation has fought hard to regain its sovereignty. I will not allow it to be ridiculed for American electoral purposes. He turned to Konate, with an expression that mixed resolution and seriousness. Please also reach out to our embassy in Washington and our regional allies. I want everyone to be aware of what we are about to do. Back in New York, the lights in the Fox News studio were brightened, creating that characteristic glow that smoothed out imperfections and heightened the air of authority. Technicians scurried through the hallways, checking connections and audio levels one last time. Sean Matthews, the host of America first. Adjusted his navy suit as a makeup artist put the finishing touches on his face. With 15 years of experience, Matthews knew exactly how to conduct high-profile interviews, especially with Trump, whose appearances often deviated from the planned script. "How are we doing with the Africa questions?" he asked the executive producer, who was frantically checking her tablet. "We have 4 minutes reserved for African politics, focusing primarily on the growing Chinese and Russian influence in the Sahel region," she replied, without looking up. "The research department has sent updated data on Burkina Faso and Mali. Trump was specifically instructed to emphasize new economic development initiatives, not military issues." Matthews nodded, knowing full well that educated was an optimistic word when it came to Trump. "And what do we know about this new leader, Traoré? I have a feeling Trump will mention him." The producer hesitated. "A military captain, he took power a little over a year ago after a coup. Harvard has an interesting article about him. Apparently he has a PhD in military strategy and speaks 5 languages." "Interesting," Matthews muttered, but was interrupted by Trump's entrance into the studio, surrounded by a small entourage of aides and Secret Service agents. The room immediately transformed, cameras adjusted, lights checked, microphones tested one last time. Trump strode across the studio with the confidence of someone who knew the power of television intimately, briefly nodding to the crew. "Sean, my friend." Trump extended his hand for a firm shake. "We're going to give them an incredible show today. Top ratings. Phenomenal." Matthews smiled professionally as he led the president to his seat. Reynolds, the communications aide, approached to give final instructions, but Trump waved him away impatiently. "We're on the air in 3, 2, 1. The director announced, and the cameras began to broadcast live to millions of Americans. "Good evening, America." Matthews began with his trademark smile. "We are here with the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, to discuss the global challenges facing our nation, from rising tensions with China to instability on the African continent." In the shadows of the studio, Reynolds watched nervously, his phone buzzing with unread messages from the State Department. One caught his eye. "Urgent, Embassy in Burkina Faso reports unusual activity. President Traoré has mobilized communications team. Possible coordinated response to today's interview." Reynolds paled, looking at Trump, who was already gesturing excitedly as he answered the first question about China. He tried to discreetly signal to Matthews to stick strictly to the approved script, but the host was already moving on to the next topic. "Mr. President, in recent months we have seen a significant shift in African alliances, with countries traditionally aligned with the West seeking new partners such as Russia and China. How do you assess this situation?" A faint smile formed on Trump's lips. It was exactly the cue he was waiting for. "Look, Sean, what we're seeing in Africa is a complete failure of leadership. These countries have immense resources, tremendous resources, but they're run by people who don't know what they're doing. Take this guy in Burkina Faso, for example." Reynolds closed his eyes momentarily, knowing that what came next could trigger a diplomatic crisis. What no one in the studio suspected was that every word was being closely monitored 5,000 miles away, where a counterattack was already being meticulously prepared. What would unfold in the next 45 minutes would not only break all viewership records in the history of Fox News, but would also forever redefine the power relations between the world's superpowers and African nations that have long been considered mere pawns in the grand game of global geopolitics. "This Traoré guy," Trump continued, his voice growing more confident as he noticed the positive reaction from the off-camera crew, "is an incompetent little dictator of a bankrupt country. I don't even know why we're talking about him. Who cares what happens in, what's his name? Burkina Faso?" The way Trump pronounced the country's name, with deliberate difficulty and obvious disdain, drew snickers from some crew members off-camera. Sean Matthews, the host, sensed the diplomatic danger in the remarks and tried to subtly redirect the conversation. "Mr. President, regarding regional security concerns, Sean, let me tell you something." Trump interrupted, leaning forward with that trademark hand gesture that comedians love to imitate. "This guy, this captain who wasn't even elected, pulled off a coup and now he thinks he can play with the great powers? He's nothing but a puppet. The Russians pull one string, the Chinese pull another, and he dances. He's not a real leader." Backstage, Reynolds watched the scene with growing horror. His phone buzzed incessantly, messages from the State Department, alerts from the American Embassy in Ouagadougou, and a strange notification from a network executive producer informing him of an unusual request, received directly from the government of Burkina Faso. Fox's head of international operations, Julia Winters, approached Reynolds with a serious expression. "Does your boss have any idea what he's doing?" she whispered, maintaining a professional smile as she walked past staff members. "We just received a formal request from President Traoré's office. They are demanding an immediate right of reply under international defamation laws." Reynolds swallowed. That's unusual. We can deny it, right? Put it off until another day, maybe? Winters quickly checked her tablet before answering. Technically, yes. But they have a solid legal argument. And frankly, the numbers we're seeing. She turned the screen to show Reynolds' real-time viewership data that was rising exponentially. Our executive team is leaning toward allowing it. It would be historic. On set, Trump continued his tirade, seemingly oblivious to the commotion behind the scenes. Countries like this, frankly, are a waste of international aid. Billions of dollars, billions! And for what? For a 30-something captain to turn his back on the West and invite terrorists into his backyard? Matthews tried again to intervene. Mr. President, recent data indicates that Burkina Faso has made significant progress against extremist groups in the region. Fake news, Sean. Trump replied with a dismissive wave. Believe me, I know more about terrorism than anybody. Nobody knows more about terrorism than I do. And I can tell you, this Traoré guy has no idea what he's doing. 0. In Ouagadougou, the presidential palace had been transformed into a makeshift command center. Communications technicians adjusted satellite transmission equipment, while diplomatic and military aides gathered around President Traoré, who watched the Fox News broadcast with an impassive expression. He really didn't do his homework. One of the military aides said, shaking his head as Trump made yet another factually incorrect statement about the security situation in the country. That could play to our advantage. Traoré replied calmly, scribbling notes on a pad. Contrary to the image of an out-of-control dictator that Trump had painted, the Burkinabe president displayed the discipline and focus that he had developed through years of advanced military training and actual combat against insurgents. Mr. President. Konate hurried into the room. Fox News has accepted our request. You will be live in 10 minutes. A murmur ran through the room, a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Allowing its president to respond live, without a script, to provocations from the leader of the world's greatest power was a risky move. We should review the main points, sir, suggested the foreign minister, a veteran diplomat who had served under 3 different presidents. I have prepared some carefully calibrated responses that, I appreciate that, Minister. Traoré interrupted politely. But this will not be a traditional diplomatic exchange. He stood, adjusting his uniform. What Trump is doing right now is a performance for his domestic audience. He does not expect to be challenged. And he certainly does not expect someone he considers irrelevant to confront him directly. Traoré walked to a side table where detailed maps of recent military operations against extremist groups were spread out, operations that had reclaimed significant territory and protected civilian communities, but which had never received coverage in Western media. Our strategy is not to convince Trump. He continued, his voice calm but resolute. It is to show a global audience that the model of relationships between powerful nations and the African continent needs to change fundamentally. He removed his glasses, wiping them carefully as he walked to the area set up for the video conference. Konate, I want you to monitor the reactions on social media in real time. General Diallo, prepare accurate data on our counterinsurgency operations for the past 6 months, in case I need to quote it. The technical team signaled that the connection was ready. Traoré sat in front of the cameras, politely declining the makeup offered by an assistant. We want authenticity, not an elaborate production, he explained. Through the monitors, they could see Trump still speaking, now rambling on about how African countries should be more grateful for American aid. We're going live in 90 seconds, Mr. President, the communications technician informed. Konate approached one last time, speaking in a low voice. Sir, I must remind you that the diplomatic consequences may be, the consequences of continuing to accept this kind of treatment are greater, Traoré replied, adjusting his stance. There are moments, Mamadou, when a nation must decide whether it will be defined by the perception of others or by its own voice. On the monitors, they saw the Fox News director lean over to Matthews during a commercial break, whispering in his ear. The anchorman visibly paled. At the Fox News studio, controlled chaos reigned behind the scenes. The production manager had rushed over to Matthews during the commercial break, handing him a new, improvised script for the next segment. You're kidding, Matthews hissed, staring at the pages. This is unprecedented. We need legal approval for this. We already have, the director replied quickly. The executives have authorized it. It's the story of the year, Sean. Matthews swallowed hard before turning to Trump. Mr. President, we have just received an unusual request. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso watched our interview live and requested an immediate right of reply. Our network has agreed to connect him via satellite for the final minutes of the program. Trump's face went through an almost comical sequence of expressions, first disbelief, then confusion, followed by a momentary flash of what looked like apprehension, before settling into something approaching his usual confidence. Is he watching? Is this something we need to do now? Reynolds, who had been watching the entire sequence with growing alarm, rushed to the set as soon as he realized what was happening. "Mr. President, I do not recommend this unplanned confrontation. We can schedule something more structured later. This was clearly not in the brief and we have to. I'm not prepared for this," Trump said quietly to Reynolds, a rare admission of vulnerability that surprised the aide. "What do we know about this guy?" Reynolds frantically consulted his tablet. "Captain Ibrahim Traoré, 35, assumed the presidency following a military coup in September 2022. Military training from the Kamsagan Academy and a master's degree in..." He hesitated. "Military strategy. Speaks fluent English, French, Arabic, and at least 2 local languages. Led successful operations against JNIM and other al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in the region." Trump blinked, processing the information. For a brief moment, Reynolds thought the president might back down. But then Trump adjusted his tie, quickly regaining his usual composure. "No, it's fine. I'm not afraid to talk to him. In fact, it'll be great for the ratings, won't it?" He smiled for the cameras as the commercial break came to an end. "America doesn't back down. And I definitely won't." Matthews, sensing the historic potential of the moment, quickly composed himself professionally. The commercial break ended, and he returned to the air with a tight smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an unprecedented situation this evening. The president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, who we were just talking about, has requested the right of reply and is live with us via satellite. President Traoré, can you hear us?" The screen split, showing Trump in the plush New York studio and, on the other side, Traoré sitting in his presidential office in Ouagadougou. The visual contrast could not have been more striking. While Trump was surrounded by the glitz and production of a state-of-the-art professional television studio, Traoré appeared in a more austere setting, with the Burkina Faso flag behind him and a serious, composed expression. Behind the scenes, the technical team held their breath. No one knew what to expect. The executive producers, monitoring the data in real time, watched in amazement as the ratings exploded, with thousands of additional viewers tuning in every second. "Yes, I can hear you perfectly, Mr. Matthews," Traoré replied in fluent English, his voice calm and controlled, without any hint of the out-of-control dictator Trump had described him as moments earlier. "I appreciate the opportunity to address the American people and President Trump directly." Trump forced a smile, crossing his arms defensively, a body language gesture that did not go unnoticed by millions of viewers accustomed to analyzing every move of political leaders. "Well, that's unexpected. Hello, President Traoré." Traoré inclined his head slightly in formal acknowledgement. "President Trump, I have been watching your interview with great interest, especially when you chose to take the time to discuss my country and my leadership. Just telling you how I see it." Trump responded with a characteristic shrug, trying to regain control of the narrative. "I'm known for telling the truth, even if it's hard to hear. I always tell it like it is." "The truth," Traoré repeated calmly, letting the word hang in the air for a calculated moment. "Interesting that you mention that. Allow me to share some truths as well." The studio fell silent. Cameras captured the moment, Trump instinctively adjusting his posture, Matthews glancing nervously between the two leaders, and Traoré, with almost disconcerting calm, preparing to speak. On the auxiliary monitors, the ratings continued to climb steeply, breaking records for all previous network shows. "When you referred to me as an incompetent little dictator and Burkina Faso as a failed country full of terrorists, you demonstrated not only a profound ignorance of my country, but also the same colonial pattern of thinking that has damaged relations between our nations for decades." Trump tried to interrupt, but Traoré held up his hand firmly, a simple but surprisingly effective gesture that made Trump back down, something American viewers rarely witnessed. "Please allow me to conclude, as you have had your time to speak. Courtesy is fundamental in international diplomacy." At that moment, something extraordinary happened in the studio. Trump sat back in his seat, and Matthews, sensing the rising tension and the unusual dynamic taking place, dared not interfere. The camera technicians, sensing the historic moment, locked the frame on the eyes of both leaders, the growing irritation in Trump's eyes and the unshakable resolve in Traoré's. Behind the scenes, Reynolds frantically checked his phone, which kept ringing, calls from the State Department, the White House, even Republican leaders who watched in horror as the scene unfolded. Julia Winters, the director of international operations, watched in fascination, whispering to a colleague, "This is a game-changer. Completely." On social media, the moment was already exploding, with hashtags like #TraRespond and #AfricaFala shooting up global trending topics within minutes. The visual contrast, the unexpected confrontation, the eloquence of the African leader, all the elements combined to create what was already being called the most extraordinary moment in American political television in decades. And Traoré, fully aware of the historical weight of the moment, continued to speak with a clarity and precision that contrasted sharply with the image Trump had tried to paint of him. The world watched, and the old power dynamics, so deeply rooted in international relations, began imperceptibly to shift before the eyes of millions of spectators. Burkina Faso is a sovereign nation with a rich and complex history. Traoré continued, his voice ringing with a clarity that captured everyone's attention. Our decision to reassess military alliances was not made on a whim, but based on the interests of our people after years of foreign presence that failed to contain the terrorist threat in our region. The lighting in the Fox News studio, designed to flatter guests and smooth out imperfections, now seemed to work against Trump. Beads of sweat began to form on his forehead as the cameras flicked back and forth between the two leaders, capturing every reaction, every micro-expression. Trump's normally flawless makeup began to crack under the heat of the lights and the pressure of the unexpected moment. Backstage, Reynolds watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. A senior executive producer approached him, whispering, "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of television. He's destroying Trump without even raising his voice." In the Fox News control room, technical directors watched in amazement as the ratings figures continued to soar. The show had broken all previous viewership records, even surpassing presidential debates. Network executives, initially apprehensive about allowing the unplanned showdown, were now exchanging glances that mixed surprise with a kind of professional admiration for the historic television moment they were producing. Cut to Trump's reaction. The director ordered over intercom. "Keep the close-up on him. This is pure gold." Traoré paused strategically, allowing his opening words to sink in. His expression remained composed, in sharp contrast to Trump's growing unease. "As for your assessment of my age and experience, I must remind you that I have a master's degree in military science and served on the front lines against terrorist groups that you only know about from intelligence reports. While you were discussing golf in your private clubs, I was burying my fellow soldiers who had died in battle." The camera caught Trump uncrossing his arms, visibly uneasy. His mouth twisted into an expression that millions of Americans recognized, the harbinger of an impending disruption. Matthews, sensing danger, shot Trump a barely perceptible warning glance, silently reminding him of his aide's instructions to maintain composure. "And as for being a puppet of Russia and China," Traoré continued, now leaning forward slightly, "I suggest you look at recent history. Burkina Faso did not expel French troops and simply replace them with others. Our policy is one of sovereignty and mutually beneficial cooperation with any nation that respects our self-determination. We are not playing powers against each other, we are simply demanding respect as equals at the negotiating table. The American public deserves leaders who understand the complexity of the world beyond the borders of the United States," Traoré concluded. "Especially those countries you consider too small to deserve respect or understanding." The silence that followed was almost palpable. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if Trump was genuinely at a loss for words, a phenomenon so rare that members of the coaching staff exchanged incredulous glances. Matthews, feeling the need to fill the unexpected void, was poised to intervene when Trump finally recovered. In Ouagadougou, the command room that had been set up around Traoré was dead silent. Aides watched, mesmerized, as the confrontation unfolded on their screens. Konate frantically monitored social media reactions on his tablet, occasionally passing notes to an aide who discreetly placed them on the table next to Traoré, real-time data, statistics and reactions that the president could call upon if needed. The foreign minister, who had served under 3 different administrations, leaned over to whisper to a colleague. "In 30 years of diplomacy, I have never seen an African leader confront an American president like this. This is historic." Outside the presidential palace, a small crowd was beginning to form. News of the televised confrontation had spread quickly through the streets of Ouagadougou. University students, shopkeepers, civil servants, ordinary people who rarely saw their country mentioned in the international media, much less defended so eloquently on the global stage, were gathering spontaneously, some with portable radios, others watching on their TVs. Back at the Fox News studio, the atmosphere had changed. What had begun as another routine interview with Trump, familiar territory for both him and the network, had morphed into an unprecedented international diplomatic showdown, broadcast live to an audience that now included viewers on every continent, as clips of the moment went viral in real time. Trump regained his composure, leaning forward with his signature finger pointed at the camera, a gesture that had intimidated political opponents in countless debates, but which now, against the backdrop of Traoré's unshakable composure, seemed almost theatrical. "Look, I respect your passion, I really do," he said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "But let's look at the facts. Your country is among the poorest in the world. You came to power through a military coup, not an election like me. And now you're flirting with autocratic regimes like Russia and China that don't have your people's best interests at heart." Trump smiled confidently for the camera, resorting to a tactic he had used countless times before, deflecting from the central argument to speak directly to his base of supporters. The American people know that I always put America first, and that means being honest about global threats. When countries like yours align with our adversaries, it is a threat to American security. The broadcast cut back to Traoré, who had been patiently waiting for Trump to finish. The calm on his face remained unchanged, creating a visual contrast that did not go unnoticed by the millions of viewers. President Trump, Traoré began, his voice measured and deliberate. Allow me to clarify a few points. Yes, Burkina Faso faces significant economic challenges, many of them resulting from centuries of colonial exploitation and decades of international economic policies that systematically disadvantage African nations. Traoré paused briefly, discreetly consulting some notes in front of him. The gesture, far from appearing to be a sign of weakness, conveyed an impression of meticulousness and preparation that contrasted with Trump's more improvisational approach. To put this into context, when our country declared independence in 1960, we inherited an education system with only 8% literacy and an infrastructure designed exclusively to extract resources, not to develop a sustainable economy. Our current poverty is not a historical accident or a reflection of leadership competence. It is the direct result of global systems that you, as an international businessman, surely understand. The mention of Trump's business career was a calculated move. On social media, political analysts were already highlighting how Traoré was skillfully using Trump's own record against him, without resorting to direct personal attacks. As for your mention that I came to power through a military coup, I do not deny that. Traoré continued. I assumed leadership in extraordinary circumstances when our country was facing an existential threat from terrorist groups that had taken control of almost 40% of our national territory. The people of Burkina Faso supported this transition because they recognized the urgent need for a new approach. Traoré leaned forward slightly, a subtle but effective move that conveyed intensity without aggression. Let me ask you, President Trump, if terrorist groups controlled 40% of the American territory, if schools in nearly half of your country were forced to close, if farmers were unable to access their land for fear of mass executions, what measures would you consider justifiable? Democracy requires, above all, basic stability and security to function. The question hung in the air, rhetorical but powerful. Trump shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable with the role reversal. He, usually the de facto interviewer who conducted conversations on his own terms, now found himself in the unusual position of having to answer substantive questions. And on relations with Russia and China, it would be hypocritical of me to refuse partnerships that offer concrete benefits to my people without the neo-colonial conditions that often accompany Western assistance. Traoré continued. The United States maintains extensive trade relations with both countries while criticizing others for doing the same. At the State Department offices in Washington, D.C., senior officials had interrupted a meeting on Middle East policy to watch the televised confrontation. Secretary of State Thompson watched with a grave expression, occasionally taking notes. This is precisely the scenario we are trying to avoid with the briefings prepared for the president, said an undersecretary for Africa, not hiding his frustration. Traoré is no ordinary dictator. He holds an honorary doctorate from Geneva and speaks 6 languages. We specifically warn against underestimating him. Thompson nodded slowly. Start preparing a mitigation strategy. This will reverberate throughout West Africa. The broadcast briefly cut away to show the reaction of the audience on social media, where hashtags such as #TraorésTrump and #AfricaRespond were exploding in popularity. Clips of the confrontation were already going viral, with many viewers expressing surprise at the African leader's articulation and firmness. When the camera returned to the studio, Trump was visibly upset. His body language had changed completely, the confident smile replaced by a tense expression, his gestures more rigid and defensive. That's typical, he said, gesturing emphatically. Always blaming others for your problems. America has overcome much greater adversity to become the greatest nation in the world. No one colonized America, and look where we are. At some point, you have to take responsibility and stop blaming the past. The statement hung in the air for a moment. Backstage, Reynolds closed his eyes, immediately recognizing the colossal factual error. Matthews, the host, nearly choked on the water he was drinking, while the executive producers looked on in amazement. A faint smile crossed Traoré's face as he waited for Trump to finish his remarks. It was the kind of smile that college professors give to students who have just made a fundamental mistake, an expression of polite patience that communicated volumes without the need for words. President Trump, he said slowly, your statement about nobody colonized America is historically inaccurate and, ironically, illustrates precisely the point I'm trying to make about the importance of knowing history before making public statements. The camera caught Trump blinking several times in quick succession, a rare moment of visible confusion. He glanced briefly at Matthews, as if expecting some life-saving intervention, but the host remained silent, apparently as interested in Traoré's response as the millions watching. Traoré adjusted his glasses before continuing. The United States literally began as a colony. The very name of your country, the United States of America, reflects its British colonial origins, not to mention the indigenous populations that were systematically displaced and exterminated in the process of building the American nation. A stunned silence fell over the studio. Matthews glanced nervously between his two guests, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Backstage, Reynolds was already on his phone, frantically trying to contact experts who could salvage the situation post-show. But we are not here to give history lessons, Traoré continued, offering a graceful way out of the awkward moment. We are discussing contemporary international relations and the mutual respect needed between leaders of sovereign nations, regardless of size or economic power. In Ouagadougou, the command room had been transformed. The initial respectful silence had given way to a subdued, almost electric energy. Konate stared at his tablet, where messages from Burkinabe embassies around the world were arriving in real time. African leaders were watching, foreign ministries were monitoring. The African Union had interrupted a session to follow the confrontation. The president of Nigeria just tweeted his support. An aide whispered. Ghana, Senegal, and Ivory Coast too. Outside the palace, the crowd had grown exponentially. Makeshift screens showed the broadcast, and each response from Traoré was met with applause and cheers. Local and international journalists began to gather, realizing that they were witnessing a moment that transcended a simple in the studio. A visibly frustrated Trump adjusted his tie as he glanced at his watch, a gesture that was immediately interpreted by viewers as a sign of discomfort. Look, I have a very busy schedule running the world's largest economy. We can philosophize about history all day long, but in the end, results matter. And the results in your country speak for themselves. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, to re-establish the power dynamics Trump was accustomed to. The reference to his busy schedule was a classic move to indicate superiority and impatience, but against the backdrop of Traoré's unshakable composure, the gesture seemed small, almost childish. Indeed, results matter, Traoré agreed, his voice taking on a new dimension of authority that emanated not from aggression but from genuine confidence. In just 1 year of my administration, we have recovered 30% of the territory that was under terrorist control. We have established new agricultural partnerships that are reducing our dependence on imports. And most importantly, we are paving the way for genuine self-determination for the first time in our post-colonial history. He paused meaningfully before adding, As for your busy schedule, I sincerely appreciate that you found time to discuss Burkina Faso so extensively today, especially considering that you previously admitted that you don't even know where my country is. The response was flawless in its execution, polite on the surface, devastating in its content. On social media, the comment was already being reproduced, memed and celebrated as the final blow of a confrontation that no one had foreseen. Across the Atlantic, at the French president's official residence in Paris, aides had woken Emmanuel Macron to watch the clash. France, Burkina Faso's former colonial power, and whose influence in the region had declined significantly since the expulsion of its troops, was watching with particular interest. It's extraordinary, the French foreign minister said. He has just done in 15 minutes what decades of Pan-Africanist movements have tried to do, to force the West to see African leaders as intellectual and political peers, not as passive recipients of aid or pawns on the geopolitical chessboard. Macron nodded slowly. Prepare a phone call to Traoré tomorrow. The political terrain has just shifted. At the Fox News studio, Matthews realized that time was running out for the segment. A seasoned professional, he knew he needed to end the confrontation in a way that would save as much of Trump's dignity as possible while capitalizing on the historic moment for the network. Thank you to both presidents for this extraordinary exchange, he began, but was interrupted by Trump, who had apparently decided to try one last card. I just want to say one thing before we close, Trump interjected, ignoring his aide's signals to conclude. It's easy to criticize and lecture when you're on the outside, when you don't have the responsibilities that I have. Maybe one day, if your country can develop enough to be relevant on the world stage, you'll understand the weight of the decisions that leaders of great nations have to make. It was a last-ditch effort to restore order, to put the African leader in his place. But as soon as the words left his mouth, it became painfully obvious to everyone, the production crew, the viewers at home, and even Trump himself, that he had made another tactical error. The camera panned back to Traoré, who remained silent for a few seconds, allowing the weight of the moment and the implications of Trump's words to fully sink in. When he finally spoke, his voice had taken on a different tone, no longer educational or diplomatic, but deeply personal and authentic. President Trump, a nation's relevance is not measured by the size of its GDP or its military arsenal, but by the dignity with which it treats its citizens and the integrity with which it relates to other nations," he said, each word heavy with meaning. "In Burkina Faso, we have a proverb: an ant can make an elephant bleed if it knows where to bite. Maybe this is one of those moments." It was a perfect response, at once an elegant closing and a powerful statement that resonated not only with the immediate context but with the larger symbolism of what was happening: a smaller nation, long ignored or belittled, finally making its voice heard on the global stage. The broadcast cut to Matthews, who seemed momentarily speechless, a rare phenomenon for a presenter of his experience. "With that, we conclude this truly historic segment," he said finally. "President Trump, President Traoré, thank you for this extraordinary conversation." When the cameras cut out and the show went to commercial break, the studio fell silent for a few moments. Trump, his face visibly red, snatched away his microphone and stood up abruptly. "Who approved this?" he demanded, to no one in particular. "Who the hell approved this?" Reynolds approached cautiously, aware that the next few minutes would be crucial in managing both Trump's mood and the international repercussions of the confrontation. "Mr. President, we are already preparing a communication strategy to—" "I don't want strategy. I want to know who set this ambush," Trump interrupted, his voice echoing through the now silent studio. "And I want someone to tell me exactly who this guy is and why no one prepared me for him." The irony of the situation, Trump demanding information that had been included in briefings he routinely ignored, was not lost on the staff, though no one dared mention it at the time. Meanwhile, on the control room screen still showing the broadcast from Ouagadougou, Traoré simply removed his microphone, politely thanked the technical team, and turned to his aide with a calm but resolute expression. The contrast between the two scenes could not have been more striking: chaos on one side, composure on the other. And in that moment, for millions of viewers around the world, the traditional power dynamics between Western superpowers and African nations had been irrevocably altered. In the seconds after the live showdown ended, the Fox News studio was transformed into a hive of chaos. Aides immediately surrounded Trump, forming a human barrier between him and the few journalists present. Conflicting orders echoed through the hallways as executive producers simultaneously tried to capitalize on record ratings and mitigate the diplomatic disaster that had just occurred. "We need to be back on the air in 90 seconds, the director shouted, frantically checking his stopwatch. "Matthews, are you ready?" Sean Matthews, the host who had sat through countless controversial interviews throughout his career, still looked dazed. He mechanically accepted the makeup artist's touch-ups as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. In his 20 years of television journalism, he had never seen an American president so completely disarmed on national television. "We're changing the format for the next segment," the executive producer said, handing him a new script. "No commentary on what just happened. Let's go straight to the economic analysis with the panel." "Got it?" Matthews nodded silently, adjusting his headset. On the monitors around him, he could see social media exploding with clips of the confrontation, commentary from world leaders beginning to emerge, and political analysts rushing to their respective network studios to comment on the historic moment. Across the studio, Trump was in a heated argument with Reynolds, his communications advisor. "I want a formal retraction from them. A public apology," he demanded, his face still red with frustration. "I demand equal time to respond without interruptions." "Mr. President, with all due respect," Reynolds tried to explain, keeping his voice low. "Technically, you were the one who initiated the criticism of Burkina Faso and President Traoré. In terms of public relations, demanding a retraction after, I don't care who started it." Trump interrupted, his voice rising high enough for nearby technicians to hear. That little captain just humiliated me on my own network. I want action, and I want it now." Reynolds exchanged worried glances with other aides. They all knew they were witnessing the beginning of a storm that would last for days, perhaps weeks. Trump never handled public humiliation well, and this one had been especially devastating, not just because of the contrast in his composure, but because it had occurred in a domain where he had traditionally reigned supreme: primetime television. "Sir, we'll be back on the air in 30 seconds, the director said, approaching cautiously. "Would you like to remain in economy as planned, or—" The question hung in the air, fraught with implications. Staying would mean facing cameras that had just captured her most vulnerable moment since the presidential campaign. Leaving would represent a tacit admission of defeat. Trump adjusted his tie sharply. "I have appointments at the White House. Reynolds has all the economic information you need." With that, he turned and walked out of the studio, surrounded by Secret Service agents, leaving behind a vacuum of almost palpable tension. Matthews, watching the hasty exit, took a deep breath and prepared to return to the air. "We're on the air in 5, 4, 3. The director completed the countdown with silent gestures. "Welcome back to America First." Matthews began with characteristic professionalism, though attentive observers could hear a slight strain in his voice. Due to commitments at the White House, President Trump has had to leave us. We will now turn to our economic panel to discuss recent developments in the American labor market. In living rooms across the country, viewers greeted the abrupt transition with skepticism. On social media, the hashtag Trump does the question began to circulate, joining the dozens of other hashtags related to the confrontation that were already trending. In Ouagadougou, the mood was completely different. When Traoré removed his microphone and rose from his chair after the broadcast, the command room erupted in subdued applause, a rare display of emotion for a normally reserved team of diplomats and military strategists. Mr. President, Konate approached, his tablet still flashing with incessant notifications. We are receiving feedback from across the continent. The African Union has called an extraordinary session for tomorrow. The President of Nigeria is on the line wanting to speak in person. Traoré raised his hand in a gesture to calm the rising excitement. Let's stay focused, please. This was not about humiliating President Trump or creating a media spectacle. It was about setting a new precedent for how African leaders should be treated on the international stage. He walked to the window, where he could hear the growing hubbub outside. The spontaneous crowd had grown to thousands, filling the streets around the presidential palace. National flags were waved, traditional drums were beginning to beat, and there was a palpable sense of collective pride that transcended political or tribal affiliations. What is the situation in the most remote regions? Traoré asked, turning to the communications minister. We are broadcasting the clash via national radio to areas without internet coverage, the minister replied. Mobile teams are taking large screens to villages in the interior. We are receiving reports of spontaneous celebrations even in areas previously considered critical in terms of support for the government. Traoré nodded thoughtfully. Take this moment to reinforce our central message. Burkina Faso is rebuilding its sovereignty not only militarily, but also diplomatically. Our fight against terrorism and for economic recovery is not isolated from the global issues of respect and self-determination. Konate watched his leader with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Mr. President, if I may ask, you seem to have anticipated exactly how Trump would react. How were you so prepared? A faint smile crossed Traoré's face. It wasn't hard. Leaders like Trump follow predictable patterns when confronted, first dismissive, then angry, finally resorting to arguments about their own power and importance. It's the same dynamic we've seen for centuries in relations between colonial powers and African nations, only condensed into minutes instead of decades. He turned his attention back to the documents on his desk, operational maps, intelligence reports, infrastructure plans. The challenge now will be to turn this symbolic moment into concrete progress. Global attention is fleeting, Konate. We have a narrow window to capitalize on this. Meanwhile, in newspaper offices around the world, editors were scrambling to update headlines and reconfigure front pages. The televised showdown had shaken up the traditional hierarchy of international coverage, forcing media outlets to prioritize a story involving an African leader that many had barely mentioned before. At the New York Times offices, an emergency editorial meeting was underway. We need immediate context, the editor-in-chief demanded. Who is this Traoré? How did he come to power? What does he mean for African politics? And we need experts who can analyze every word of that confrontation. I have already contacted 3 professors of African studies, a senior editor responded. The problem is that there is very little previous coverage of Burkina Faso in our archives. We are essentially building from scratch. The admission hung heavily over the room, a tacit acknowledgement of the Western media's historical neglect of African nations deemed peripheral to mainstream geopolitical interests. On CNN, Anderson Cooper conducted a live interview with the retired U.S. ambassador to West Africa. In all my years of diplomatic service, the ambassador said, I have never seen an African leader confront an American president so directly. What we saw today represents a fundamental shift in diplomatic dynamics. And what does this mean for U.S.-Africa relations going forward? Cooper asked. The impact cannot be understated, the ambassador responded. For decades, American policy toward Africa has been conducted with the implicit assumption that African leaders would accept virtually any condition or treatment in exchange for international aid. What Traoré did today was effectively declare the end of that era. At the White House, a crisis meeting had been quickly convened in the Situation Room. Senior aides, communications strategists, and State Department representatives sat around the Oval Table, all aware of the gravity of the moment. The president is absolutely furious, the chief of staff reported, closing the door. And frankly, this is a public relations disaster. We need a coherent strategy, and we need it now. Secretary of State Thompson sighed heavily. I have tried to warn about this repeatedly. Our briefings on the new generation of African leaders have been consistently ignored. Traoré is not a traditional dictator. He is articulate, strategically astute, and perfectly capable of communicating directly with Western audiences. The question is not how we got here. The White House communications director interrupted. The question is how we respond. We have three basic options: retaliate diplomatically, which would further alienate African allies, ignore it altogether, which would appear weak, or try to somehow turn this into a productive conversation among leaders. The silence that followed was telling. Either option seemed adequate for the unprecedented situation they faced. There is a fourth option, a younger aide finally suggested, choosing his words carefully. We could learn something from this. Recalibrate our approach to West Africa based on current realities, not outdated assumptions. Skeptical looks were exchanged around the table. The president would never accept that. The chief of staff replied. Not after what happened today. So we're just stuck, Thompson concluded. Because the reality is that Africa is changing much faster than our policy toward the continent. 3 days later, the televised confrontation continued to dominate the global news cycle. Analysts dissected every word and gesture, historians contextualized the moment within the broader arc of post-colonial relations, and political scientists debated the implications for world order. At universities around the world, professors were already incorporating the event into their lesson plans, recognizing its educational value in illustrating concepts of soft power, public diplomacy, and the dynamics of the international system. Trump, who had retreated to Mar-a-Lago without making any public appearances since the incident, finally broke his silence with a series of social media posts. The fake media is completely distorting my productive conversation with the leader of Burkina Faso, he wrote. It was a strong discussion between two strong leaders. I respect anyone who defends their country with passion. The attempt to reset the narrative was met with widespread skepticism, particularly because Trump had consistently avoided mentioning Traoré by name, referring to him only as the leader of Burkina Faso, a detail that did not go unnoticed by commentators. In Ouagadougou, Traoré had quickly returned to his normal routine, dividing his time between security meetings on counterterrorism operations and economic development initiatives. Outwardly, it appeared that the Burkinabe president was deliberately downplaying the incident, refusing to turn it into a personal victory and insisting that his team remain focused on national priorities. But the impact continued to reverberate in more subtle ways. American diplomats in the region reported a palpable shift in the atmosphere of their meetings with African counterparts, a new assertiveness, a more direct questioning of assumptions, and occasionally, humorous but pointed references to the Traoré moment. A week later, during a routine press conference, a journalist asked Traoré whether he considered that the confrontation with Trump had achieved its objectives. This was not about personal or even national goals, he replied thoughtfully. This was about demonstrating that international dialogue can no longer take place on terms unilaterally imposed by major powers. When smaller nations accept being treated with condescension or disdain, they are not only compromising their own dignity, they are reinforcing a deeply imbalanced global system. He paused, considering his next words carefully. What happened on that show was not about Trump or Traoré. It was about the right of every nation, regardless of its size or wealth, to be treated with the same respect we demand of each other as human beings. In Washington, D.C., an internal State Department memo leaked to the press revealed a new directive. All future diplomatic communications relating to African nations should be preceded by detailed briefings on the history, culture, and contemporary circumstances of the country in question. The previous approach of generalized briefings on African issues is no longer considered appropriate. The document, which quickly went viral in diplomatic circles, included an unattributed quote that many suspected was from Secretary Thompson herself. The era when we could afford not to know African leaders while they were obliged to know every detail about us is over. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Sean Matthews, the host who had witnessed the historic moment firsthand, published an op-ed in the Washington Post that captured the sentiment of many observers. What we witnessed that night was not just an American president being confronted by an African leader. It was the symbolic end of an era in which Western nations could talk about, but never with, the African continent. For decades, American leaders of both parties had treated Africa simultaneously as a problem to be solved and a resource to be exploited, rarely as a partner to be respected. In 15 minutes of live television, Traoré didn't just challenge that dynamic, he shattered it irrevocably. And the momentary silence that followed, that stunned second in which a normally loquacious American president found himself genuinely speechless, may well be remembered as the precise moment when a new global order began to take shape. In his presidential office in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré was wrapping up a video conference with education ministers from neighboring countries about a new regional technical school initiative. As the meeting concluded, he allowed himself a rare moment of personal reflection. On his desk was a small pile of international correspondence, letters from African, Asian, and Latin American leaders expressing admiration for his position. There were also invitations to global conferences where Burkina Faso had previously been, at best, a peripheral participant. Konate entered silently, placing the first print edition of a book on the table. The Traoré Moment, Africa, Diplomacy and the New Global Balance, published with impressive speed by a university press. They are already analyzing what happened as a historic event, Konate said. The BBC is producing a documentary. 3 American universities have added the confrontation to their international relations curriculum. Traoré looked at the book cover with a neutral expression. And while the world discusses symbolism, we continue our real work. What is it? Asked Konate. To build a country where one day it will not be extraordinary for an African leader to speak on equal terms with any other nation. Traoré replied, turning his attention to the documents in front of him. Plans for schools, hospitals and infrastructure in regions recently liberated from terrorist control. For the global media and international analysts, the confrontation had been a defining moment, a turning point in traditional power relations. But for Traoré, it had been just a necessary step in a much longer journey, the journey of a nation determined to define its own destiny. In his weekly address to the nation, broadcast on radio to reach even the most remote villages, Traoré made no mention of Trump or the televised confrontation. Instead, he spoke of new schools reopening in the north, agricultural projects that were increasing food security, and vocational training programs for young people. Our dignity as a nation, he concluded, is not measured by moments of international recognition, but by the daily reality we build for our people. True sovereignty is not declared in global broadcasts, but built village by village, community by community, with consistent work and clear vision. Meanwhile, at the White House, aides were still carefully trying to avoid mentioning Burkina Faso in meetings with Mr. Trump. But in the State Department library, young staffers were quietly forming study groups to learn more about the new generation of African leaders who, like Mr. Traoré, were no longer willing to accept the traditional terms of international engagement. The world had witnessed something rare, a moment when the curtains of global power were briefly drawn back, revealing different possibilities for interaction between nations. What would emerge from this moment, whether it would be truly transformative or merely a passing anomaly, remained to be determined. But one thing was certain, no one who witnessed those 15 minutes of live television would ever look at relations between Western superpowers and African nations in the same way again. And perhaps, as Traoré had suggested in his final answer, that was precisely the point. Did you like it? Leave your like and subscribe. We have much more exclusive content like this. Share this video and don't miss our next reveals.